What's up, YouTube? Today I'm going to be rebuilding our kitchen pantry cabinet to make it a little bit more functional. Right now, it's a very narrow and deep cabinet, so a lot of times food gets shoved to the back and forgotten about. So what we'll be doing is essentially doubling it in size, and then we'll also be adding some pull-out drawers to make it a little bit more usable. If you want to see how I did it, stick around. I start by breaking down some 1/2-inch birch plywood. I'm going with 1/2 inch because that is what my existing cabinet is made out of, and going with birch because it's a higher grade plywood, and if you spend enough time sifting through the stacks at your big box store, typically you can find some pieces you'd be comfortable having on display in your kitchen. Now I can measure and make my marks to cut out the toe kick, and I make sure to add an X to the cutout piece just in case I happen to forget which part I'm supposed to throw away. The track saw helps ensure I have some clean and straight cuts, and a handsaw can finish off the last bit. I decided to use dado joints for the cabinet carcass only because my existing cabinets also use a dado joint. To do this, I add grooves to the side panels that will accept the middle shelf and the top cabinet. I use a straight edge that I then can run my router against with a 1/2-inch bit to make the cut. Given the width of the material, I only take these about 1/8 inch deep, and I clean up the edges with some sandpaper. The middle shelf is 3/4 inch ply. Since I don't have a 3/4 inch bit, I make my first cut, slide the straight edge over 1/4 inch, and cut again to get the correct dado. I now move on to prep the face frames, which will also take a dado. For this, I'm using maple 1x3s, and it is worth splurging the few extra dollars for maple over poplar because maple is much harder, it tends to take paint better, and overall it's just going to hold up better in a high traffic area like the kitchen. Some of you more experienced viewers may recognize this contraption I'm using as my table saw. I was fortunate enough to have this shopsmith passed down from a family friend. I can certainly recognize how this is not the safest tool, given it has about 47 different uses, but if you are careful, it does get the job done. So far, since I got this tool, I've only used it as a table saw. Someday I would like to learn how to use it as a lathe, drill press, massage chair, boat anchor, anything else I might be able to do, but for the time being, it works very well in my small shop. Here I am cutting a notch into the fixed shelf so I can fit around a support beam in the kitchen, and the track saw and jigsaw make quick work of this. I go ahead and sand with 180 grit followed by 220 grit, and then I wipe down all the surfaces with a microfiber cloth, followed by a tack cloth, getting all the bits of dust off before finish. For my finish, I'm using Danish oil. I do like this finish because it's very easy to apply. You just wipe it on. 15 minutes later, you can wipe off the excess. And in this case, I ended up doing 2 coats. One downside to Danish oil is that your dirty rags can, in fact, spontaneously combust. I had heard this before, never really thought it was that likely until I saw a video by Bourbon Moth Woodworking where he does an experiment on this. If you have not seen the video, it's definitely worth checking out. But it is very surprising how easily a bundled up oily rag in a trash can catch on fire. Now the last step. As I run my hand on the surface, I can feel some bumps, so I very lightly run 220 grit sandpaper across for a smooth finish. Moving on to the dry assembly. I am very thankful I added the dado joints because this would have been a nightmare trying to assemble this without them. At this point, everything is just clamped together to make sure I didn't screw up the cuts too bad, and I can stand up this heavy cabinet. Look at that, it fits. To add structure to the bottom, I attach some scrap plywood with pocket screws, which the bottom plate will rest on top of. Lastly, I need to chisel grooves into the face frame, and this is to make room for the cabinet top and middle shelf so the face frame can sit flat against them. Fortunately for me, everything fits right into place. Now that I know everything fits, we can run it back, while this time adding glue to all the joints. I make sure to get the cutouts for the beam in the correct spot and hoist this puppy back up again. I shoot some pin nails in to lock everything into place while the glue dries. One oversight I noticed after the fact is that I should have attached my horizontal face frame to the vertical face frame with pocket screws. Because I didn't do this, that means that these pieces could move independently of each other, and I did notice some slight cracks in the paint at the seams after install. With a little filler and touch-up paint, this ended up being fine, but next time I will make sure to make a solid face frame. Just a couple of blowouts I need to patch before paint. My local Sherwin-Williams did a color match with my existing cabinets, and I went with the highest grade quality paint and primer that they recommended for kitchen cabinets. If you're interested in all the steps I take for cabinet painting, I do go into full detail in a previous video where I built an LED lit shoe rack. You can check that out here in the link. Now we can demo the previous cabinet. Always fun to bust out the Sawzall, which chews right through the existing cabinet, and the rest of the carcass popped out surprisingly easily. I am using toggle bolts to attach the backing to the wall on the left side of the beam because there were no studs in this span. On the right side, I could attach this piece directly to the studs. Once I pushed the toggles into the drywall, I screwed in for a tight fit. I add a bead of glue along the edge before sliding the cabinet into position. I had also pre-drilled pocket holes into the backing pieces, which lets me lock in the cabinet sides, and then I can close up the bottom. If I wasn't such a perfectionist, I could have moved to the next step, but the color of the grain on the backing didn't quite match the rest of the plywood, so I cut and finished another piece of birch to cover the backing piece, and I nail it into place. The bump out for the beam gets clad with finished 1/8 inch birch that is glued and nailed into place. Lastly, some tan caulking helps fill any of the seams at the corners and finish off the inside. Moving on to the drawers, I could start to cut dados into the sides of my boxes. I would gladly be doing this on my router table, but unfortunately the maple for the face frame took its toll on the old 1.5 horsepower Craftsman router and burned out the motor. So instead I get to chunk through the joints 1/8 inch at a time on all 20 side pieces. I'm just using glue and 18 gauge nails to attach my sides because the strength of the drawers will come from the bottom plate locking into the dados. Right angle clamps help keep everything square while the glue dries. I add some tight bond around the perimeter. The bottom plate is cut 1/8 inch short of the distance between the dados and just takes a little hip thrust to get it into place. I cut a temporary block to clamp in the back, which keeps my spacing where it needs to be, and I can check my diagonals to be sure we are still square. These nails are probably overkill, but I figured why not throw some in there. And as I trim out the drawer back, I realize it's better to nail at an angle into the bottom corner to minimize blowout risk. The front of the drawer gets a 1/16 inch roundover just to cut the edge, followed by some final sanding to prep for finish. I'm going with a water-based polyurethane finish because it applies very easily and it's durable. This was my first time spraying polyurethane, so I decided to dilute with about 8% water. I give everything a good stir and load up my Home Right Super Finish Max paint sprayer. For $80, it has saved me a ton of time and it gives great results. To apply, just spray everything until it's covered. The poly looks a little milky when it's wet, so you can easily tell what parts you have sprayed and what parts you haven't. I do the bottom first, flip over, and then do the top. Once it's dry, I can give everything a light sanding with 400 grit to knock down any bumps, and that gets me ready for the final coat. Same deal for coat number 2. Here you can see what the poly looks like while it's still wet and how it has that kind of milky color. All in all, I was really impressed with how easy this finish was to apply and how well it turned out. Last up that I saw as a suggestion online is to just take a piece of paper bag, rub it all over the surfaces. This will knock down any nubs and it leaves you with a smooth finish. Moving on to the drawer hardware, I picked these slides up off of Amazon. I slapped them onto each side of the drawer and use a 3/4 inch plywood spacer for consistent placement. I can then install the bracket into the cabinet, making sure I stay level and that spacing is correct in all directions. The drawer clips in, and who doesn't love a nice soft close? I will admit I did not make the doors. Instead, I ordered them to size on eBay. They ended up being great quality and exactly the size I ordered, delivered to my door only 3 short months later. And at this point, I'm just ready for this project to be done. It's one of those zombie projects that seems to drag on forever. I wanted to have a functioning pantry by the time my son was born, and that was in March. Here I am in August, finally getting the doors and final trim pieces installed. As I'm excited to take my final shots, get this video posted, and move on with my life, I find a slightly demoralizing mistake. I did not expect the open doors to overhang the face frame so much that it would prevent the drawer from opening. First, I found some full clearance hinges online that were $90 each, so those were out of the question. I did find some other hinges that made it so I could resolve this issue by trimming off about 1/8 inch from each side of the drawer. So I make some cuts with the track saw, which gives me grooves that the hinges will sit into, and I refinish the exposed plywood. I then need to remove some paint from the face frame so I can glue on these 1/8 inch thick maple tabs that will push the cabinet bracket in far enough so that it's out of the way of the door as the drawer opens. I reassemble everything, which I'm sure nobody wants to watch again, and finally I can put a bow on this project. I think this build really highlights a lot of people's relationship with woodworking. Mistakes are inevitable and they are frustrating, but anytime I make a mistake, I have nobody to be frustrated with but myself. If I think about it long enough, typically I could find some creative solution to get past it. That, in and of itself, is pretty rewarding. If you've made it this far and you didn't hate this video, give that subscribe button just a little tap, and thanks everybody for watching.